Good afternoon and welcome to the Family Business Center's Employment Policies webinar. We're glad you could be with us today. Before we get started, I want to tell you a little bit about some upcoming events that are happening so that you can have them all on your calendars. September 24th, we are going to have our Next Generation Social, so all of our Next Gen members out there can join us at the Goose Island Brewery. And if you need more information on that, please email us at fbc@luc.edu. October 1st, we have our full-day conference at the Four Seasons Hotel, exploring the themes of next generation leaders and building excellence into next generation leadership. It's for the whole family. So early registration, I believe, is ending soon, so please sign up as soon as you can for that. And November 19th, we have our Illinois Family Business of the Year Awards at the Four Seasons. Also, we are the Midwest chapter of the Family Business Network North America. So there are some additional events that are happening that you can participate in as a member there. And two webinars, one on building credibility and influence, which is a next generation only webinar, and a full family webinar in October on reducing stress, emergency transition planning in the family business. And finally, our FBN North America Forum in Miami will happen November 12th and 13th with a program for the full family on breaking barriers and strengthening communication. And it will be followed by a Next Generation conference on November 13th and 14th, Next Generation Only conference, with social events hosted by the family that owns Brown-Forman and Tonti Properties hosting the social events for those programs. So have those dates on your calendar, and I hope we can see you all there. So our agenda for today is really to look at the topic of employment policies, to understand the role of family business policies in general and understand the context for an employment policy, understand what goes into an employment policy, how do you create it, and the key components. So I want to start by just saying that ownership unity and family cohesion is the greatest advantage a family business has. If our family isn't unified about where we're going and what we're trying to do, we're going to expend a lot of energy that could go into the success of the businesses and our contributions to the community and our philanthropy. We're going to spend that energy on family conflict, family problems. So whenever we're thinking about policies, we want our policies to be focused on how do we build ownership unity and family cohesion through setting some clear expectations with our policies and procedures. So if we go to the next slide, when I talk about family cohesion, what I'm talking about is building a sense of unity that leads to a common sense of purpose and leads us to joint action. So this is not coercion, this is not bribery, this is, we want people to be unified about where we're going because of that common sense of purpose that we have, and that common sense of purpose leads us to joint action. So our policy should be in service of that. Next slide, please. Because what we know is family businesses that survive for multiple generations, that survive across hundreds of years, have four kind of main components to the sense of connection that they have with each other. While we spend most of our time focusing on the lower right quadrant, which we talk about as business financial, which is the unity based on the success of our businesses, and certainly business success is necessary, but it's not sufficient to get us from one generation to the next. For families to survive for hundreds of years, they really need the top two quadrants, which are a sense of family attachment, that family emotional connection to each other, and business emotional, a sense of pride, identity, and status that comes from being a part of the family business. So our policies should be doing what we can to make sure that we're taking care of both the business financial and the family emotional and business emotional parts of the equation. Next slide, please. Because we have a lot of forces in a family that are kind of pulling us apart. And what the employment policy does is starts to try to get to managing the complex systems that we have and the overlap that we have in a family business. In a family business, you've got your family system, your ownership system, and your management system. And you can see the overlap. So some family members are playing a role both in the business and in the family. Some have ownership, some don't. So the reason this is important is because we play a different role in each of these systems. In the family system, it's a loyalty-based system. We typically seek to take care of, nurture, protect, have loyalty to each other. That's just based on who we are. Now, a management system is much more of a meritocracy, so when we start to talk about family members being employed in the business, we start to have a clash in the values sets between the two systems. So in the family system based on loyalty and a management system that's much more temporal and based on performance, we can already start to see a little bit of a clash. So our employment policies start to try to create a clarity of expectations about how we're going to handle the overlap between the management and the family system. Next slide. Now, the other reason that an employment policy can be important is because the complexity of our family is going to grow across generations. My experience has shown that when you get to the second to third generation transitions is typically when more families put time and effort into employment policies because the complexity of the family is growing immensely. And it's harder to keep everybody unified and on the same page and with the same expectations about how we're going to treat each other. And again, in a family system, we tend to think more on a fairness and equality perspective than in a business system, which again is more of a meritocracy purely. So we have to manage the complexity of the approach with those two different systems. The employment policy is one of the ways that we start to create clarity of expectations for a group that's growing, that's much more diverse, that may include in-laws, so that every family member has a sense of fairness in the process that's going to be implemented to take care of employment decisions in a family business. And I should say here that if people perceive the process as fair, even if a decision that is made that doesn't go their way, they're much more likely to support that decision than in a situation where the process isn't fair, where there isn't communication and there aren't common expectations. This is why an employment policy is very important. The next slide, please. Now, I also want to stress that the employment policy is just one part of your family governance strategy. And you should have a governance strategy for how are we going to build unity in the family moving forward, and the employment policy is just one piece of it. Now, many of us may end up with an employment policy before we have a governance strategy, before we have a family constitution which outlines all of the values, the vision, the mission, and the policies and procedures that we're going to have. So I'm going to take a few minutes to just talk about the family constitution as a context for where the employment policy should typically fit in a family business governance system. But all of your families should be thinking about what is our family governance strategy to build family unity. Because if our family's not unified, it's going to be much harder to transition from one generation to the next. Next slide, please. So a family constitution articulates the expectations, and it's not just on the employment issues, but on a number of issues in the family business, ranging from dividends to liquidity policies, code of conduct, mission, vision. The family constitution is much like the Constitution of the U.S. It's the founding document that guides our actions and our behaviors, talks about our reason for being, and then talks about how we implement it through providing a structure to build family unity. Next slide, please. It's a comprehensive articulation of our philosophies, our principles, and our policies for the future that balances the welfare of the family, the owners, and the business. So if you go back to the three-circle model that I was just talking about, It's making sure that we don't get too far out of whack where the family system is dominating, the ownership system is dominating, or the business system is dominating. Because we know typically that if the family system is dominating, the family drama is distracting from keeping the business alive and healthy. If the ownership system is dominating, we're often taking too much money out of the business to keep the business alive and healthy. And if we're focusing too much on the business, and the business is the only thing that connects us, the strength of the family relationships, we're not building that sense of strength in the family relationships that will sustain us across time. So the Constitution is a way that families create a document that creates that common set of expectations to strengthen both the family and the business. Next slide, please. So the components of a family constitution, there are three main components. There's the family statement, the mission, and the vision, and the values are typically outlined in the family statement. It's our reason for being, it's the values that guide us in our decision making, our vision for the future, the why behind what we're doing. Our policies and governance, and this is where your employment policy would fit in, are all the different policies that help us set expectations about how we're going to interact with each other as family members. It may be our dividend policy, it may be our employment policy, it may be the protocol for getting onto the board, how our family council operates, how our family meetings run. All of that structure is kind of covered in the family business protocol. And finally, we have our shareholders agreements, or our legal agreements, that inevitably we have to have as shareholders to govern our interactions to each other. So the employment policy in its highest and best use should be a part of an overall governance strategy and be a part of that family business protocol in the family constitution. Next slide. So the purpose of any policy really, again, as part of that overarching family governance strategy, is to operationalize the values and the principles and to try to make the actions concrete and measurable. So if we say one of our values is hard work or integrity or honesty, that our policy aligns with that and articulates how we're going to measure the values, how we're going to make sure that people are living up to the values that we've articulated. And so this is why oftentimes it's helpful to start with mission and vision values before you get into an employment policy, because then some of your decisions about the specifics of an employment policy, outside work experience, advancement, etc., become clearer because you connect them to your values as a family, your values as a business, and your values moving forward. And this, again, the policy helps manage the complexity and manage the expectations of family members. And just a note of caution is that if there's an issue that you're trying to create a policy for that is a particularly challenging one or emotional one, you might not want to try to make that the first one that you tackle. I often encourage families to start with issues that feel easier and then work their way up to the more complex policies, the ones that are more emotionally charged. Next slide, please. Now, the other thing is one of the common traps that family businesses run into, and the employment policy is hopefully designed to help out with, is that the trap that a lot of families run into is they see employment in the family business as the only way to add value in the family business system. And the outgrowth of that is oftentimes family members will choose to come into the family business only because that's where the power and importance and feeling a part of the family happens, is by becoming an employee, or flip side, they can be forced into the family business because the parents feel like that's the only place that they can take care of and protect and look after their kids. So what happens in that situation is it's usually not a very good situation for the successor. Our employment policy really tries to articulate when you can come into the business and why, and make sure that it's an alignment with who they are and what they want in their life, in their career. So I want to stress, before we get into the specifics of the employment policy, that there are many ways to contribute in a family business. It's not just working in the family business. You certainly need leaders in the business and on the board, but you can also lead as an owner. You can lead the family meetings. You can take part in financial and estate planning. And you need emotional leadership at times in family businesses. So all of that's to say, employment is just one aspect of the full family business system. The next slide really shows us the many different roles that people can play, and we want to think about, just as we have the employment policy to govern when family members can work in the business and under what conditions, we also want to have similar types of policies and clear expectations for family participation in the family council, in the family meetings. We want to think about that in terms of our foundation and ownership. You know, what are our rules around ownership and participation at the board? Just as the employment policy sets expectations for the family that enters the business, we need those same types of expectations in the other parts of the family business system. That's part of the more overarching family governance strategy. Next slide, please. At the end of the day, my belief in what we teach here is that the ideal is for us to find a way to help each family member in the family business find their sweet spot. And that's the convergence between your capabilities, your interests, and what the world needs, or in the context of your family business, what your family business needs. If we're encouraging family members to go into the family business and it's not aligned with their interests or their capabilities or the business's needs, we're usually not going to end up in a good situation in terms of our family relationships, because somebody's going to end up in a position that they're not qualified for, they're not interested in, or that the business doesn't need. And that ultimately leads often to family conflict, depression, and in worst cases, things like drug abuse and deep family problems. So the end goal for all of us should be that we are focusing on helping each family member find their sweet spot and making sure that family members know that it's okay that if my interests or my capabilities aren't aligned with the family business, that I can still play a meaningful role in the family governance through family meetings, through family leadership, and other roles, and that employment in the business is not the only way to be important or a part of the family business. That helps to deal with what I call the successor's curse. The successor's curse is something that everybody who grows up in a family business has to deal with at some point. That successor's curse is that your successes and your failures are always going to be seen in relation to your family's successes. So it seems for many successors like their successes are not purely their own, because people feel like if this person's been successful, they're only successful because they were given the silver spoon, because their parents looked after them, because they were born into this family business. So it's hard for the next generation to find their place, to find their authentic leadership style. So if we don't pay attention to finding the sweet spot, it makes it much harder to overcome and deal with the successor's curse. And the challenge for a successor in overcoming the successor's curse is establishing credibility with other people. establishing credibility with other people starts internally and with becoming credible yourself, and your employment policy should be thinking about that. How do we make sure that somebody who's coming into the business has a track record of credibility so that they can feel confident that they're prepared for the job, and that the people working for the business can understand that this person's qualified and credible for their job and has the capability to meet the needs of the business. Because if we don't have alignment in those situations, we are setting our family up for failure. Next slide, please. So the employment policy is created to make explicit the processes, procedures, and the criteria that will govern how family members, including spouses oftentimes, will participate in employment with the family business. And I will tell you that every family has their own nuances to this, and some families have very simple policies and some have more complex policies with different layers, and it really has to fit your family and your family culture. So when I include spouses in this definition, not every family allows spouses to work for their family business, and that's a decision your family has to make consciously. And either decision you make has consequences, and you just have to be aware of the impact of those decisions and any of the decisions you make about your around your employment policy and the impact that they might have on family relationships, which is at the end of the day what we're talking about, is keeping that sense of family unity. Next slide, please. So we want to use our employment policy to manage that complexity that we talked about earlier, to create a clear sense of expectations, a sense of fairness. Again, I'm going to say this a couple of times throughout the rest of this program, which is that the process that we use to create the employment policy is just as important as the policy itself. When we look at the policy at the end of the day, does it seem fair and unbiased, and that everybody in the system will be treated fairly? The business will be treated fairly, the family will be treated fairly, and the owners will be treated fairly. Does it foster both the development of the business and the family? At the end of the day, our employment policy shouldn't just think about the entrance to the business. This is the mistake I think most people make in their employment policies, is that they focus solely on governing the entrance of a family member into the family business. And in its highest and best form, the employment policy should be broader than that and go deeper in that, and think about all of the different ways that family members engage with the business at the employment level. So we want it to foster the development of the family members and help the family members grow in their lives and their careers. We don't want people to get stuck in a place where they feel stifled in the business, and we want them to continue to grow and develop. We also want it to kind of give them a sense of purpose in their life and their career. So this requires some pretty honest conversations as a family. Next slide, please. This is why I encourage families to think beyond just the hiring of family members and think about the career, the span of a career of a family member and all the different components that go into that. My belief is that your employment policy should cover all of these different aspects. It should govern what are the conditions under which we would hire a family member. Of course, I'll go into this in a little bit into each of these areas, but after we hire somebody, how are we going to continue to evaluate their performance and make sure that they're accountable for fulfilling the duties of their role? What are the rules of advancement are going to be? You know, one of the biggest issues that comes up in the advancement question is, are family members treated the same as non-family members? Do family members get a leg up, since we hope that they will be leaders in the business moving forward, there are a lot of dilemmas that we have to kind of dig into around advancement in the family business to make sure that people perceive the process as being fair, and that's both within the family as well as the non-family. Because in all of our family businesses, we have non-family executives who are looking to the family for emotional cues about how we're supposed to behave, how decisions are made, what are our values, and the decisions we make around advancement are indicators of that. And then finally, we'll talk about exit, because I think if we can think about the conditions under which family members may need to leave the business ahead of time, we've already set a frame for some rules that will help any exit be smoother. And I'll be honest with you and say that a family member leaving the family business is rarely a smooth and painless process, but certainly if we think about it ahead of time and set some level of structure in our employment policy about how those situations will be handled, it can reduce the volume of the emotion that happens in that process. Next slide, please. So let's go deeper into the question of hiring. So it starts with what types of positions are available. Will a position be created for a family member, or does a position have to be open? That's a very basic philosophical question. And families are on both sides of the fence. And I wish I could tell you there was a volume of research that tells you which of these are better than others, but the reality is there hasn't been that type of research. So even the common recommendation that you work 2 to 3, 2 to 5 years outside of the family business, there's not a whole lot of research that has been done on that, so we don't have conclusive research evidence. But the philosophy behind outside work experience is that, coming back to that question of the successor's curse, is what's the easiest way for a next generation member to build credibility and self-esteem, self-confidence, to have an arena where they can make some mistakes and learn more about themselves. And the philosophy behind outside work experience is that it's easier to do that when you're not working for your parents than working for your parents. So that's the philosophy about working outside the family business. But when we look at the employment policy, we may have different qualifications based on the different types of jobs that we might be having. Summer jobs might be very loosey-goosey in terms of the actual requirements. Internships might be a little bit more demanding. When you start getting into management and leadership, you're going to get more specific. So there are a number of families that have actually chosen, and this is something that I think is often a reaction to the fears of what could happen with family employment, but there are some families that actually don't allow family members to work for the family business. What we know from experience is that makes it harder to keep the family connected to the actual business operations over time, but it's certainly a choice that many families have made and continue to be successful. So thinking about what are the criteria in the different positions, how much work experience. One family actually has a rule that if you want to be in a management or leadership role, you have to have an MBA. So thinking not just about entrance to the business, but working up the food chain and what kind of experiences and track record you need to have. Some families in their employment policies have a requirement that you don't just need outside work experience, but you have to have achieved a promotion at the job you've been at. You have to be a high performer before you'll be considered to come into the family business. And I think one of the most important questions beyond just degree and work experience is the question of values and characters. Does the individual that we're considering for a job exhibit and represent the values and the character of the family? At the end of the day, if we believe in our values, our mission, and our vision, family members and their behavior should really be strongly aligned with the values and character that we espouse as a family. And that we'll come back to that again when we talk about accountability and consequences. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about advancement. So advancement starts with setting clear expectations. Sometimes what happens in family businesses is we don't clearly define the role that a family member is stepping into. We don't have a job description. We don't have clear goals and expectations for them. We just kind of throw them at something and say, go at it. And it certainly can be a valuable learning experience at times, but it also can create a lot of emotional angst in the family because we don't know how to measure somebody's success if we don't give them clear goals, we don't have a clear job description. It's hard to understand, are they successful at what they're doing, and should they be considered for advancement? So in any of these situations, at any level in a family business, we should have clear job descriptions and clear goals and a clear process for how we're going to measure those goals and give somebody feedback. Because one of the things we hear from family businesses on a regular basis is that successors get a few different types of feedback. They either get sugar-coated feedback because nobody wants to tell them the real truth because they're afraid that this person's going to be their boss someday and that's going to come back to haunt them. They get overly harsh feedback. Oftentimes the parent doesn't want the child to be seen as entitled or favored in any way, so the parents will actually be more harsh on their family business or their family members than they will on non-family members. And then the third option that we often see is no feedback at all. So how is it that we're going to give the next generation or any family member who comes into the family business real feedback on their performance? Because it's only through real feedback that a family member is going to understand, what am I doing well, what am I not doing well, how can I adjust my behavior to meet expectations, which is the core of self-esteem. And if you go back to finding your sweet spot is about finding a sense of self-esteem, that I'm competent, I'm capable. And so we need to give people, family members, feedback about their performance so they know where they stand. And that feedback has to be objective. It can't be biased political feedback. It can't be sugar-coated. It can't be overly harsh. It has to be as close as we can to objective feedback. So some mechanisms we can use to help family members in this include personality inventories that help them understand what are the strengths and weaknesses of their personality. 360s, which for those of you who haven't had them, basically what you do is you get feedback from the people that report to you, the people that are at your level, and then your bosses, and you get feedback on your leadership skills, how you show up as a leader, what you need to work on, and that feedback can be used in coaching. A little caveat there is that you don't want to use 360 feedback to make compensation decisions or evaluation for promotion. It should be leadership development so that you don't get people giving inaccurate feedback because they don't want somebody promoted, or they're going to sugarcoat the feedback because they don't want to be the reason somebody didn't get promoted. Really, the feedback should be about the growth and development of the person. And then the third piece is, how will decisions be made regarding advancement? I think one of the best situations that I've seen in family businesses is when there's a committee of the board that governs the employment process for family members within the organization, and that committee includes not only family members, but often the HR director, maybe the CEO or other senior leaders in the organization that help think about how do we foster the growth and development, develop realistic assessments of each of the next generation members as they come in, and make sure that our decisions about advancement are fair, clear, and transparent. Again, the process being just as important as the end outcome. So at the beginning of the day, we want to be clear with everybody about how we're going to make decisions regarding advancement. So this may be different for every family. A board committee may be more relevant for a larger, older family firm with more family members involved. In smaller family businesses, it may just be mom or dad who's the CEO making those decisions. And in many families that have large businesses, it may just be an internal non-family member that's making certain decisions around advancement. But at the end of the day, we need to have a strategy as a family about how we're going to manage the advancement of family members through the business. Next slide, please. So at the heart of this advancement question is the concept of accountability. And this is something that families talk about often as being a very difficult thing as a family, because you love and you care for your family member, but how do you hold them accountable? In some ways, a sibling feels like they shouldn't have to answer completely to their sibling. That's more of a natural parent-to-child thing. But I think in a family business system, we work best when we have clear accountability to each other. So when I talk about accountability, I talk about it as an obligation or willingness to accept responsibility or account for one's actions. So that I want to offer you a model, a simple model, which we will see on the next slide, for understanding accountability and thinking about accountability in a family business. So the simple model of accountability starts with setting expectations. This is where most families in their employment policies falter. So we don't set clear expectations. We don't have a conversation and invite commitment. So it's not just setting clear expectations, but making sure that the person that we're engaging with is committed to that common set of expectations and that we both signed off. Sometimes in a family business, we just expect each other to know what each other's thinking. We assume that what I think is the same thing that our family member thinks, and we actually may have different expectations. So the first two steps, setting expectations and making sure that we're both committed to those expectations, is where many families falter. So in your employment policy, what you're doing is setting those expectations, making them clear. In the process of creating your employment policy, you're inviting people's commitment by involving them in the process of setting those expectations. So if mom and dad go off into a room and set all these expectations and come down and decree them from on a high, it makes it less likely that the next generation is going to feel invited into a sense of commitment to those expectations. If you flip that around and the parents actually engage with the next generation and say, we're trying to set up some rules about what should govern your entrance into the business and your advancement within the business, what do you guys think would be fair? And it's a dialogue between the generations. You're going to invite much more commitment from the next generation to living up to those expectations. Of course, we have to measure progress and figure out how often are we going to measure progress, what are the metrics we're going to use to measure progress, provide feedback to family members when they are working towards that, and then also have consequences. I think this is another area where families often stumble, which is that they are afraid to create waves in the family and have clear consequences. So it's the family member who never gets reprimanded when they step out of line on a policy. And then it teaches non-family members that family members are untouchables and they don't have to live by the same rules as non-family members, and then can create a culture or a feeling of unfairness in the culture. And ultimately, we want our policies to be promoting fairness, and we have to think very carefully about the relationship between family and non-family. So it's not just fairness within the family process, it's fairness between the family and the non-family as well, because we want the to invite the commitment of the non-family members to the set of expectations and growth in the vision of where we're going, just as much as we want to invite the commitment of family members. So linking to consequences and making sure that there is clarity between both family and non-family about what the consequences are, and that family members are held accountable to that, and that the effectiveness of family members is evaluated. You know, the quickest way to lose credibility in a family business situation of credibility with the non-family members is to not have any clear expectations, not have any measurement of progress, and over-promote family members just because you want to take care of them. It's confusing the family role with the business role, and it doesn't help the family member in the long run, and it doesn't help the business in the long run. So remember the simple model of accountability, and think about how it can apply to your employment policy. Next slide, please. So the last component of the family business employment policy that I want to talk about is probably the most emotional and the most difficult, which is exiting. And I want to talk about it from two different angles. One is voluntary, and the other is involuntary. You might think that involuntary would be the hardest, and it often is, but voluntary departures can often be just as emotional because the family member is making the choice to not be a part of the family endeavor. And emotionally, some family members may interpret that as betrayal. They may interpret that as a slight against them. So the emotions are often extremely high around any exit from the family business. So we, you know, in looking at the employment policy, if we can start to articulate what the path is if you're leaving voluntarily or if you're leaving involuntarily, what that path looks like. And so again, this is easier if we've done the work on the front end. If we set clear expectations, if we brought people into positions that they were qualified for, prepared for, if those positions were useful and necessary, we're setting family members up for success. If we're not bringing people, if we're bringing in people with unclear expectations, with no job descriptions, and not giving them much direction, not giving them much evaluation, not giving them much feedback, exiting is going to be much harder. Sometimes that may even be the reason that somebody may choose to leave voluntarily, is they don't have a clear sense of how they can be successful. And that's usually not good for somebody's self-esteem or for family harmony in the long run. So when we're talking about voluntarily leaving, I think the best practices orient around making it clear why you're leaving, leaving in a way that has respect for the family and the business. You're not leaving things in a lurch, that you're giving the family and the time to plan for your departure, and you're doing it in as healthy a way as you can in terms from a communication standpoint, that you're not just dropping the ball and leaving at the end of the day, dropping your ball and going home. You're saying, listen, I'm not happy, and I want to find other opportunities. I need something more for my life and my career, and I'm going to leave in 1, 3, 6 months, whatever it is, giving the family some amount of time to adjust to your departure. Now, the involuntary departure is obviously much more emotional and much more difficult to deal with. And I would emphasize that it should be based on clear accountability wherever possible. If we've got clear data that supports a track record of not performing, there's more objective data that can help the individual understand, hopefully, the reality that they're not performing, and that the decision is being made on that account. Because the underlying message when we're firing a family member is not the business departure of we're removing you from your role. It's the emotional feeling of a family member rejecting them. And if it's a parent, it's very emotional. My parent is rejecting me. And the emotional experience can be devastating for a family member when a parental figure is saying that you haven't been performing and haven't been doing your job. The emotional message that people often hear on the unconscious level is, I'm not worthy, I'm not loved. And so in the process of managing the exit of a family member from the business, we need to not just attend to the surface level, the content level of the accountability, saying this is the track record and this is why you're no longer going to be working for the company. We also have to, if we value our relationships with our family members and we want family unity and strong family connections across generations, we also need to attend to the emotional messages underneath. We need to communicate that we care about them as a family member and that this is not a family decision saying that we don't love them, we don't care for them, that they're a bad person. We don't want to shame them. There's enough shame that comes with firing on its own right that we don't want our behaviors to communicate any sense of shaming on them. That just exacerbates that feeling of rejection, that feeling of loss. And it is a death of sorts, an emotional death of sorts of hopes and dreams for a career. And wherever possible, we want to help that family member find their next activity and use the family resources, whether that's emotional support, networking connections, some financial support. We want to help them find their next step and get on to happiness. So your traditional business consultant's not going to tell you that. Your traditional business consultant's not going to encourage you to attend to the emotional relationships of the family, but that's critical if you want to maximize your opportunity for success as a family emotionally in terms of your sense of connection with each other across time. If we just fire a family member and treat it as if they were any other employee, everybody in the family knows that they're a family member, and if we're just trying to treat it like a business issue, we're ignoring the family relationship that everybody knows exists. So we need to address both levels, the content as well as the emotion underneath in the process. A good friend of mine likes to say, when a family member is not performing and they haven't been adjusting, we need to have a conversation with them about what's going to make them happy, because they can't be happy if they're not performing. There's got to be some level of unhappiness, because if they were happy and if they were engaged and they were capable, they would be performing. And as a family member, I want you to be happy. So let's have a conversation about what's going to make you happy and how do we as a family help you get there. And how do we give you the time to figure that out so that you can have the best for your life and your family moving forward. So again, handling exits from the family business is probably the most emotional issue you're going to face in the family business context. So deal with it carefully. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit before we end, and if any of you have any questions that you want to add but before we close out the day, there's a dialog box on your right-hand side. You can type those questions in and we'll get them and we'll answer them at the end. But I want to talk a little bit about the process of creating an employment policy. I'm going to reemphasize that concept that the process that you use to create your employment policy is as important as the outcome. So creating involvement is important. So if it's just the parents going off into the room and making their decision on their own, and they have 20 or 30-year-olds who are going to be affected by this policy, it's going to feel odd and different and challenging, and that it's less likely that the next generation is going to have a sense of commitment to that employment policy. When you start the process, we want to be clear about how the policy is going to be approved or ratified. Does it have to be a unanimous vote, or is it a majority rule? If we're clear about that ahead of time, we don't run into problems with people feeling like somebody jerry-rigged the process at the end of the day to get what they wanted in the employment policy. In reality, you want the actual vote or decision to be a non-event. You want everybody to feel like that they were a part of the process, they know what's in the policy, that their voice was heard about the policy, and that we can move forward because it was the will of the group. Again, involve those who have a stake in the game. So that may even include non-family members. In fact, one of our members actually just completed a project where they're thinking about bringing their G4 in, and they wanted to get a sense from the non-family members in senior leadership about what are their questions and concerns about the entrance of this next generation into the business. Think about that. It can be the next generation that you want to involve in the conversation. It can be your key non-family management. Think about the non-family managers that may have a fear or a sense of being displaced by a next generation member coming into the business. If they feel a part of the process, they're likely to feel a lot less threatened. Make the process transparent. I like to say transparency builds trust, secrecy destroys trust. So if this is all happening behind, it's like the Wizard of Oz, if it's all happening behind the curtain, it's not necessarily building trust. If we're transparent about the process, people are involved in the process, there's going to be much more trust and enforceability of any employment policy that we create. And then realize that any employment policy that you create is going to be good for a place in time, and that the growth of the family, the growth of the business, changes in the business environment, changes in the family environment may make it necessary to change your policy. So have a regular process for reviewing your policies to make sure they make sense, because the employment policy that made sense in a second to third generation transition may not make sense for those in a third to fourth generation transition, so on and so forth. So have a process for reviewing your employment policy. Next slide. So one final thought is really for the parents out there, and well, really all family members, but support your next generation for where they are. I want to encourage you not to try to force people into positions, because it often doesn't end well when people feel forced into position when they don't make a conscious choice to pursue their career in the family business. And so I think about it in kind of putting them into three groups. The new leader in the next generation is the one that knows that they want to pursue a career in the family business, and your challenge with them may be in making sure that they come in at the right time, that you don't rush them into the family business, that you give them the opportunity to grow and develop at a pace that's necessary for them. The explorer is the one who might want to pursue a career in the family business, but they're not sure. So give them opportunities to connect with the family business at other levels. Some are internships, some are jobs. Give them opportunities to test it out. Make sure that they have a way to make sure it's the right decision if they want to come into the family business, that they're not just doing it because it's the easiest option, or they don't want to do the work to find a job somewhere else. And then, of course, the engaged steward is the individual who doesn't have any interest in a career in the family business, but they do want to support the efforts as a family. Don't make those people feel any don't make them feel ostracized, don't make them feel any different than anybody else, and make sure that if these are going to be future owners, that they feel connected and a part of what's happening. So that's it for my formal presentation. I have one question that came in, which was, at what age do you involve somebody in the conversation? So I was mentioning that I thought that the process should include a dialogue with all family members. The question is, what age should you engage kids in this dialogue? Obviously, when we're creating an employment policy, we're not going to be talking to a 6-year-old about what they want an employment policy to look like, because they're not going to really be able to engage with that. But really, I think when you're starting to talk about kids who are starting to enter into work age, high school kids, college kids, they can be a meaningful part of a discussion about an employment policy. They may not be able to fully understand how the family business policy fits into the larger equation of the family governance system, but they can certainly talk about how it affects them, how what you're thinking about in your employment policy affects them. And with those age groups, with those teenage groups and early 20s, asking them how do they think the policy as you envision it might affect them is a very tangible way for them to say, well, this is what it would mean to me. If you put it in the context of what's important to them, I think they'll give you some good feedback about their perceptions of your employment policy and your employment policy draft. So that's the only question we appear to have gotten. So I think we're right about time, 1:59. So thank you again for your participation, and I hope to see you all at future webinars. And if you have any further questions, feel free to follow up with us, 312-915-6490. We can hop on the phone with you and help you with any of the issues that you and your family are facing. So thanks very much, and have a great day.